Hello, Doubts Aloud listeners. It's our episode 19, and it's, as with the others, as I'd always say, it's going to be a very interesting one, and no less this time. It's July, it's the summer. We've got an interesting couple, maybe even more sessions coming up. So, but first of all, I'd just like to hand over to Ed to talk about any recent events.
Well, we're recording the morning after the Unbelievable Conference 2019. And it was this year, I was only one of the three of us who didn't go. Last year I was the only one of the three of us who didn't go. And this year I was the only representative of the
So you're balancing up. Great.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So Francis was not at the Bollocks to Brexit march. What was it called?
March for Change.
Sorry.
For Change.
Yes.
I wasn't.
But it was fun because they were all milling about. We were in central London.
Yes. Are we going to say why I wasn't at the march?
I won't say, no.
Well, I'll admit it's because I was hungover.
Oh, right. I see. Well, I thought, Ed, you might be after yesterday's conference, but...
Well, yes, we... At the end of the conference... At 5, we went off to the pub round the corner, and that closed, and then we went off to another pub. And so we didn't leave till about 10:30.
Yeah, that was like last year for me. Yeah.
Yeah, talking afterwards. I was the only atheist in the group.
Wow.
That must have been fun.
It was wonderful, yes. I love it.
Wow. So was it feeling like it was a bit like me in the last discussion group I was doing? Was it... You feel like, I don't know, in a den, like a lion's den, you know?
No, it was friendly. There was one chap sort of was a little bit pointy finger pushing, but he wasn't actually used to it. He was the husband of someone who's in our group who'd never been to it, and so it wasn't his sort of thing. So I think he wasn't in his normal kind of mode.
Right.
Of discussion, but he was actually a really nice chap. He just sort of got a bit exercised.
I mean, you normally get a mix of people, like people who are just interested in listening to discussion, and you normally get, and also with that, you get a sort of all the budding apologists who are ready to fire with all kinds of stuff that they've learned. You know, to at these sort of discussions. It depends. You get and people in between, but I found that last year. You know, but nevertheless, generally speaking, all nice people, you know.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. On the stage, they were all nice people, except one person really wound me up.
Oh, right.
And he actually, the very first time I went 4 years ago, he was also a speaker, and he wound me up. And he wound Maggie up, so there you go.
Oh, well.
I think you should name this guilty person, Ed.
Craig Hazen.
Oh, what's his particular shtick?
Talking about himself.
Oh, all right.
And what a hero he is.
Oh, no.
Wow.
Well, given as something else to talk about, it always becomes a long story about himself where he's the hero.
Right,
Oh,
interesting.
okay, yeah.
I mean, I'm exaggerating, but that was what grated. And I just imagined, after he did his talk, thinking of my friend who's the head of a theology college where my niece trained, to thinking what he'd be rolling his eyes at the stuff this chap was saying. It's, overstretching reality.
You mean when you think of other Christians, what they might say about what he's saying?
Yes, a Christian who is well educated and knows all the theology and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I was a bit like that last year, sitting next to Francis, listening to all the genocide stuff. I was thinking, this is like. To me, it felt like I felt sad in the sense that this is 101 basic apologetics on genocide, and you just need to get some people from local Bible colleges, the professors who know this stuff, and come in and just say it slightly differently, you know.
Yeah.
Or even have, I can imagine some of those people going, "Oh dear, you know, it's this is not good, and this is not good," because it's like it's one end of the Christian stuff about genocides compared with what other Christians actually say and admit, or are willing to go a different way. You know,
was this a big meeting, or was it one of the smaller seminars?
Oh, this is a big one. Don't you remember it, Francis? It was the guy. Oh, it was the guy who did the poem about the moral poem that you.
Yes. Glenn Scrivener. Yes.
Yeah. So he did this thing, and I could just now imagine him, based on his language for the genocides, I could just imagine him talking about our up-and-coming subject in a similar way, because I thought, I could just see that. I wouldn't know for sure, but it would go hand in hand. I mean, if you're going to speak like that about the genocides, as we would say, then of course you're going to have the same kind of language for anything that's really happening there.
It's in the smaller groups where, of course, you pipe up and you don't say, "Oh, I'm an atheist." You just ask a question as if you were an interested person. You couldn't tell if you're an atheist or not, and you get a much more honest, more rounded answer, which is much more helpful.
Oh, the other thing probably we've forgotten to mention, of course, is that we did the last talk that I did in Unbelievable. We didn't. We actually did the recording before I did it. So this is the next recording after I've done it.
Yes.
So, and you were both there. So do you want to say a couple of comments on that?
I thought, well, as you know, I thought you handled it absolutely brilliantly. The whole thing was very good-natured. I mean, you've talked about how you felt in the lion's den, but I felt it was good-natured, and that you never lost that openness to just taking on board what people said, but sort of saying, well, look, you've just said that, but that person over there has said something different. So why don't you two talk to each other? Which I thought was a really good gambit, and really, really what the audience did was to illustrate the talk they just heard, even though they didn't mean it. When they were trying to challenge the talk they just heard, they actually illustrated it. I mean, the talk, I should, for those who aren't aware, was on Christian diversity, and we had a diverse audience. So people were saying, "Oh, well, this, you say this, but this is the case." And then, like it would be like, "Well, of course, there's a literal Garden of Eden," and then somebody else would say, "Well, no, there's no literal Garden of Eden. That doesn't matter at all." And it was exactly what you've been pointing out in your talk.
In the talk and in the video, really.
And in the video,
Yeah, that's right. That was what struck me as well. The way you say, "Okay, you talk to you." I just loved it. It was really good.
Yeah.
I mean, you could see it coming, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Almost. You could see it coming, because what are the chances of having, in this one particular case of a talk, of having a complete range of Christians sitting there? And it actually drew a bunch of quite fundamentalists, that talk, I noticed, which was very interesting. And of course, I was trying to point out that their mindset, when they even watch the video, are probably going, "Oh, well, that's not right. Oh, yeah, that's what I believe. Oh, that's not right." Rather than seeing anything like, well, what does the whole diverse thing, could it mean to someone on the outside, was what I was trying to convey. It was quite an experience to actually be, slightly in the firing line of questions. And which was probably more than you experienced on the abortion one. Frances.
I think it was, yeah,
which is unbelievable, because you would have thought that one you might be cornered by a whole lot of people, and but so I felt a bit like Justin did when he did his book in front of us.
Yes.
In one sense, but I thought, well, that only sharpens your edges, doesn't it? And if you think, "Oh gosh, I've never thought about that," then I want to know, I want to know what I haven't thought about or understood properly. So to learn and grow. So
let's crack on. So we are going to do a summer season with. Last year we had a Summer of Atonement, and this year we are going to have a lovely, beautiful subject: the Summer of Slavery.
Wow! Yes. Okay. Slaves for the summer. How about that? So maybe that could refer to our listeners. You can be, but don't worry, slaves isn't bad. Slaves, in fact, as you'll see from this talk, is something you might even want to be.
It's good.
Now, this, of course, it is worth actually mentioning the Reasonable Doubts podcast, which is to us is the gold standard of podcasting. Yes. They did about 130 something episodes that finished about 3 years ago, and it's definitely worth finding them and going through them all. Yeah. And they had the idea. They did it. Was it a summer of?
It was the Summer of Genocide.
Summer of Genocide.
And it's
right.
like they would. Yeah, we've looked into this subject in the episode. I don't know, but it's one of the 90. But they were looking at the Canaanite sort of killing of all the people in the land after the sort of Exodus journey. And they called it Summer of Genocide. So yes, this is inspired and indebted, this phrase, to that. And so we continue that with the Summer of Slavery.
Yes, because both you and Francis have done quite a lot on this. And I thought, well, let's do a slavery special. And now it's clear that it's going to be more than one to see it all through.
That's right.
Yes. Yeah, because there's quite a lot of material here, I think.
There is. And it's also a hot subject in this last couple of decades with the anything to do with the sort of coming out from the Exodus, going into the land of Canaan and all the killings, and then the slavery things that sort of were happening around the nations, and that in the story is a hot thing today in terms of not archaeology so much, but more the morality of the Bible as it's being brought up, more than it ever used to be in the past, I would say. Yes.
Yeah. So let's kick off. Do you have some special slavery music for us?
Yes. Well, whatever you hear after this will probably be the right chosen music for it. Yes, good point. I don't know.
Well,
the Charlton Heston Moses
working in the coal mine.
Yeah, they're working in the coal mine.
Or wake up every morning. Yeah. Oh yeah, that is working in the coal mine, isn't it?
If you wanted to sort of tally and sort of curl up with the modern apologist, why not working 9 till 5?
Oh.
Because why not? That's where they're going almost.
Bob Dylan,
well, that's what they say. Yes, slavery was a 9-to-5 job, you know.
Basically.
They were wage slaves.
Yeah, that's
like
right.
we are, like we all are.
Well, there you go. Let's start with Andrew. And Andrew, could you just give us a real brief overview of slavery in the Bible?
I think one of the first places to sort of start is, in fact, there are some hundreds of references to the Israelites being slaves in Egypt, and that's quite something, that there's this constant hark back to, and for whatever reason in the passages, for you were slaves in Egypt, or this or that, because you were slaves in Egypt and you were slaves in Egypt. It goes on and on and on. There's a massive reference to slaves in Egypt, and we know the story. Out of that release of the slaves in Egypt, they sort of do the journey through Canaan, and then we get to the sort of the other side of the coin, where they're starting to battle nations, and they're heading for the promised land, and they're heading to clear the Canaanites out of the land, men, women, and children, and we've covered that. And then before long, you're getting it's sometime in that period, you're getting laws and regulations about slavery, which raises, I suppose, even to the natural reader, particularly coming from today, but really probably any time, raises the question that you've got people that were slaves who are not long having laws about regulating slaves, and to horrors, you're having passages that are talking about how to treat slaves, as we will go on to say, differently from the nations around, from even your own Hebrew slaves themselves. And then we go into what does then slavery mean? And the questions are raised by everybody. Is the slavery in Egypt the same as the slavery that the Israelites were then carrying out? And what are the issues at stake? What does this mean in morality? So basically, there was slavery in the Israelite time after settling in the land, and there was a number of passages that sort of detail the regulations and what you can and can't do, and there's some interpretive issues and problems, but there's no getting away from the fact that there is slavery in the Old Testament, and it needs looking at, and it comes through into the New Testament again with sort of regulations, but no real punch to get rid of it. And really it didn't, in terms of history, we come right the way up to only a couple of hundred years ago, where in fact slavery was abolished, and that's a whole other story in the later subjects that we'll do.
Yes.
So that's a sort of just a very, very high up view of the timeline.
Yeah. I remember in, listening in the pew, often people said where something's mentioned first is the key thing, as a sort of concept in Bible understanding. And so I think, does slavery go right back to Abraham, or is it even before that?
I mean, Abraham certainly had slaves.
Yes, slaves and servants and all of that. And when we get into the difference between, if there is a difference between slave and servant, because that's another interpretive thing, and the rights and the different ways, but it all ties into concubines and second wives for children. I mean, it's a very, very different culture.
Yes.
And Francis, you'll know more about that.
Yeah, there was a lovely bit in the essay that Francis, we might not get to this time, but there's this essay that this southern 19th century chap wrote, and he talked about Abraham having his slaves and how in modern language you say he had kind of full rights over their bodies, because of when it was decreed that they should all be circumcised. This wasn't a thing. It was like invented by Abraham, according to the story. So you can imagine all these slaves being told to do this absurd, degrading, painful thing. And yet, Abraham had full...
There's no suggestion that he said, would you mind terribly being circumcised? It's clear that he had the right to... because God ordered him to circumcise his slaves. Therefore, he had the right to do that, because God couldn't have told him to do something that he would have had no right to do without their consent. And it's very clear from the way it's put to him by God that this is something over which Abraham has complete control. It's his decision whether his male slaves are circumcised or not.
As was over any baby. So I mean, you don't ask to be circumcised, do you? You just inherit it. So I liked all that, because you normally hear people go straight to the Old Testament law, but actually there's a background even before that that's relevant. Yeah, and then there's a surrounding nation background. And Francis, I know you're going to bring in other nation codes and stuff of where some are worse than the Israelite laws, some are better.
Yeah,
and it's often ignored the ones where they're better in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, and as long as it's worse, they like to point it out.
Yes,
yeah. So let's move on to that. Francis has thought about this a lot and engaged with apologists over the years, and she has developed this list of 10 myths around slavery that she often hears people trying to peddle. So we'll go down the list, but not in her order, because some of them are more kind of Bible exegesis sort of stuff, and some of them are more general, what was conditions like in the US South. So we'll go down the more Bible-related ones first.
Okay. So let's kick off with what is in fact my number one, because it was one of the ones that I found was so common that apologists would so often say this, that Old Testament slavery was just indentured servitude. It wasn't it wasn't slavery as we think of it. That's the claim, that they were people who just for a while sold their services and had to work off a debt to a person to whom they owed the debt. And it's absolutely true that was a thing, that indentured servitude, selling yourself to pay off a debt for a limited time, was certainly one of the ways you could become a slave. It wasn't the only way you could become a slave. The other ways would be slaves. You could be a slave acquired through war. You could be a slave by being born to a slave mother, or a slave purchased from outside Israel. And all of those were chattel slaves. Chattels means property. So they were property, and they were as much someone's property as their horse or their ox or their ass would be, or a chair or a house. And in Leviticus...
Yeah, there's a verse about inheriting, isn't there?
That's right. So it's quite clear that this was not a temporary state of affairs, because it talks about how Leviticus 25, 44 to 47 says, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. It also talks a bit about buying from temporary residents living among you, and they become your property. And then it goes on, you can bequeath them to your to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. And then it goes on, something we might be touching on later, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. And that's quite a significant indication that,
absolutely, yeah,
that there's a difference between how you treat your fellow Israelites vis-a-vis slavery and how you treat foreigners.
Yeah. So is it a different word, Andrew, do you think? It says your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you.
No, I don't think it is. I know that servant and slaves can be the same word and are the same word. And of course, some people make a distinction there and some people don't in terms of the context. But no, I mean, I do know that you can't avoid, regardless of the word, you cannot avoid the distinction between, and we've seen it in the Canaanite genocides, as we call them. We know there's this massive distinction between killing everyone in the land and treating slightly differently the people outside the borders, even in the conquests, which is strikingly interesting. And of course, you know, you're not killing your own people, but you are killing these people. In other words, I think somebody said the only good Canaanite was a dead one. Mm-hmm. So this idea of Israel being chosen people and also kind of different. Now, there are lots of other laws that say treat the alien well and all of this sort of stuff, but as Francis will probably get into, a lot of these passages are referring to your own brother, Hebrews, because you do get these other passages where you just seem to get, you can treat people from other nations ruthlessly. By the very contrast, do not treat your own brothers ruthlessly. The implication very strongly in that passage twice, I believe, is that in fact ruthless treatment of people from other nations, servant or slave, can be treated ruthlessly, it seems to me.
So. And I think this is something that we may develop in one of the other shows in our Summer of Slavery. The distinction between servant and slave isn't one that exists in the ancient Hebrew. There was no word to distinguish a servant from a slave. And when in the pre-Civil War years in the American South, all the efforts of the pro-slavery arguers were to try and explain to people that where the Bible was translated as servant, that did mean slave. So they were trying to convey, where the Bible talks about servants, they do actually mean slaves. And so the Bible is saying that it's okay to have slaves because they're saying it's okay. You know, the words that you see as translated as your servant means your slave. Whereas these days, it's the exact opposite. You know, people try to say, where it says slave, you should really think of it more as meaning servant. So, you know, there's been that complete turnaround.
Yeah.
And the reason that happens is because servant, perhaps in a modern age, gives a different impression of language to say slavery, or automatically think of
yes, yeah. So moving on to something that's quite linked to that first argument about indentured servitude is, well, slaves had to be allowed to go free after 6 years. The indentured servants type slave, they had to be allowed to go free every so often. There was the year of Jubilee, and there was this general thing about couldn't be for more than 6 years, and then you had to let your slave go free. But this didn't apply to foreigners, as that passage in Leviticus clearly shows. And even amongst the Israelites, it only applied to male slaves. So in Exodus 21:7 says, if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as the male servants do. So it was not by any means a general rule. But the idea that indentured servitude had to have a limitation on it was not particular to the Old Testament. Other societies in the ancient Near East had this idea about people could sell themselves to pay off a debt, they could be indentured servants. And one of the codes from the ancient Near East. Well, the most famous code is the Code Hammurabi, and that actually mandates release after just 3 years. So when people say, "Oh, the Old Testament was so humane, it made sure that people..."
You're coming on to that later, aren't you? That myth.
That is no. That's my that's number 2 of my.
Okay, I thought you had a myth about that the Hebrew rules were so much more humane than the.
Oh yes, no. That to some extent, you see, this underpins pretty much everything. People, all the myths are about how humane are founded on, or perhaps they're not founded on, are intended to establish that the Old Testament humanized, made more humane something that was that we think of as brutal, that it was a liberalizing force, but they're all myths. I mean, there was nothing special about the Old Testament and the Old Testament treatment of slaves. You can find all of that elsewhere in other ancient Near East societies.
I made a sort of a humorous thing off air, Francis, if you remember about this, and thinking about, if you got a code of somebody from that culture sitting next to a Hebrew and say, to have that sort of conversation. Well, what are you doing this summer? I've just got out of my 3 years of slavery. Oh, I've got 4 more years.
Yes. yes. So you have the person from Babylon who's just been released because
after 3 years.
Really? Whoa, your OT means that you have to do 6. Man.
Oh, darn, that Yahweh.
Our Code Hammurabi. Whoa, we get out in 3.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, do you want to go back over some of that? Shall I go? Should we do section 2 again?
No, we're doing great.
Okay,
good stuff.
Okay. So I was going to read out from the Code Hammurabi.
Do. Yeah, absolutely.
At item number 117, it reads, "If anyone fail to meet a claim for a debt and sell himself, his wife, his son and daughter for money, or give them away to forced labour, they shall work 3 years in the house of the man who bought them, or the proprietor, and in the 4th year they shall go free." So actually it's more enlightened, not only in terms of being a shorter time, but it applies to the women as well as the men. So the Code Hammurabi is the more liberal and enlightened code in that respect. I'm not saying it would be in every single respect, but you can pick out good and bad in each.
Inspired maybe by a more progressive God. How about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to ask, don't you? And there was another rule quite close to that, which I picked out again, because I just thought it really debunks this claim of how wonderfully enlightened the Old Testament was, and it was unique in the ancient Near East, and nobody had any idea about giving slaves rights until the revolutionary idea in the Old Testament that they should at least have some rights. That even if slavery wasn't ideal, the Old Testament at least started to nudge people in the direction which nobody would ever have thought of before, that you should give slaves some rights. But at 119 of the Hammurabi Code, it says, again, it starts with, fail to meet a claim for debt, and he sell the maidservant who has borne him children for money. The money which the merchant has paid shall be repaid to him by the owner of the slave, and she shall be freed. So quite often you will get this argument that, people would treat, relative to the times, the Old Testament was so exceptionally decent. But here you have another ancient Near Eastern code saying, if you've taken a female slave for your concubine and she's borne you children, you cannot sell her. If you sell her, she goes free. And people who defend Old Testament slavery will usually say that of the passages where they suggest that a slave can go free if they're mistreated, oh, this was extraordinary. no other society in the ancient Near East would have considered this. Well, they did, because it's here, it's right here. You've got to treat that girl decently.
Yeah, that was something I was trying to put in under your number 3 myth, to put that in a different section. So we're talking about the historical setting later on, and we're just sort of doing Bible interpretation myths in this sort of whip through. Okay, so what I'm trying to do in kind of keeping a bit of my engineering kind of brain making sense of all this in a logical way is to go through the Bible references first and the myths around those, and then the broader context of the ancient Near East and comparisons with the what you call antebellum South, which is not have I pronounced that rightly?
Antebellum,
so.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So on the Bible side, sort of strictly on that, the next one is slavery in the Old Testament was not racial.
Yes, it wasn't racial in the sense of being based on skin colour, but it was certainly racial in the sense of being based on nationality and ethnic group. Because, as we've said, in Leviticus, it specifies that a fellow Israelite who has fallen onto hard times and sells himself must be treated as a hired worker, not a slave, and then let go after 6 years. And it goes on, because the Israelites are my servant whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly. And then there's this bit about how they're to come from the nations around you. And the injunction not to rule ruthlessly over a slave was categorically limited to your fellow Israelites. So they were to be treated differently. And certainly, as in our current understanding of race, that would be regarded as racial. If you discriminate against somebody because of their nation or their ethnic group, that is undoubtedly racial discrimination. They don't have to have a different skin colour for discrimination to be racial.
This was the place where it could have had some passages that said all men are created equal in the image of God and none of them should be treated ruthlessly. How about, it didn't say that. It says, you just read it. So
yeah. I mean, Jews in Europe look pretty well the same as everyone else, and yet they were desperately badly discriminated against racially for centuries.
Yeah.
Oh,
I didn't mean all men, by the way.
There's quite a lot of anti-Polish racism. Poles are certainly disliked, and there have been instances of people describing Poles as vermin. Well, I don't know about you. I can't tell a Polish person by just looking at them.
And it was the Irish before that?
Yeah, that's right. The Irish are despised.
Yeah.
And
different groups. It's, back to tribals again.
It used to be no Irish on guest house.
Yep, it was how people who were renting rooms, no dogs, no blacks, no Irish.
Yeah.
Anyway,
there's definitely passages there that just make that distinction about, even you read it, Francis, about harshly, not to and this back reference again. You were once slaves in Egypt, and you could have actually had. You were once slaves in Egypt, so we will be the pioneering nation that will not have slaves. No. Just Israelites treat them better in certain ways, and leaving it open to be harsh. And there are some passages we can talk later about the harshness of treatment of slaves.
Can I ask you a question, just in passing, really, Andrew? Is some of this confusion, say, between the indentured servitude and foreign slaves and all that different scenes and that sort of thing, is any of this that actually the Old Testament laws are slightly contradictory, that the lawmaker in Exodus set out slightly different laws to those in Deuteronomy, for example? Or something?
I think that is the case in when you get into details and nuances, that Deuteronomy does in fact have other laws about other things that are quite different than Leviticus. And you've got, the fundamentalist has a problem with that because it's like a complete contradiction. Others just say we've got development. Deuteronomy was written later. Opens up the whole can about the authorship and the dating and the spin of the writer and the editors. So it gets into a whole thing that could go on and on and on. But yes, at the end of the day, you can have a different law, like these ones about the 6 years, and ties in with the Jubilee. And therefore, people would raise questions about, well, what if you had 6 years to go, but you were 3 years off the Jubilee and stuff like that,
Yeah.
So you get complicated there. I believe it's in Exodus or Leviticus that, in fact, there's a certain scenario which would take you to be released in the Jubilee. And I think, I can't remember the book that I was reading that in, but one of them, you had to choose. I think it was, oddly enough, the later one was saying that you'd have to work to the end of the Jubilee. And if you were unlucky enough to be, the Jubilee was 49 years away, you've got that length. Whereas in the Exodus one, if you took it a certain way, you've only got 6 years. And so there are some, but this is in the detail. When you really critically look and you compare them, then you have to look at date, authorship, and interpretation of verses with wording. But yeah, you do get that. I've seen it in detail, but I can't. It would be another subject to sort of, let's take an example and talk 20 minutes on that, which could easily be done.
Okay, so we've done 3 of the list of 10 that relate to the Old Testament laws, and here's a myth. The next one, myth number 8, Francis. The Old Testament laws protected slaves by prohibiting the return of runaways.
Yes, and that's not entirely incorrect, but it's not quite what apologists want it to be. The text is from Deuteronomy 23:15-16. If a slave escapes from his master, you must not force him to return. Let him live among you in whatever town he shall choose, and do not oppress him. Do not oppress him. Well, that's nice. I'm not going to deny that. But what people tend to say is, well, this means that any runaway slave was always going to be able to seek protection and not be returned to their master, and so it wasn't like in the US where you had the Dred Scott decision and a runaway slave was forced to be returned. In fact, it only applies to slaves who had run away from a foreign territory to seek refuge in Israel, and there are 2 reasons for saying this. The first reason is that, as we've already discussed, slavery was a permitted institution in Israel. And the whole institution depends on the fact that a slave can't just decide to up sticks and leave their master. If slavery is completely voluntary and you can just walk out anytime you choose, that's not slavery. Who is going to purchase someone who can just decide they want to leave anytime they want, and there's no law, there's no legal means of getting them back? Who even is going to take on a slave on an indentured-servitude basis? If even at that level of slavery, they can just decide, stuff the 6 years, I'm leaving after 6 weeks, mate, and nobody can make me go back to you. So the very fact that there is slavery inside Israel means that this cannot have applied to Israelite slaves who were owned by people within the territory of Israel. And the other thing that makes it, I would suggest, pretty clear is let him go and live in whatever town, let him live among you in whatever town he shall choose. I mean, if you were talking about a local person, you wouldn't talk about let him live among you. That's talking about an insider. And also whatever town he shall choose. Again, that's really something that you would talk about if it's an outsider. People who are insiders go to their own home. They don't sort of think, well, where shall I pick? the choice is obvious. So you're talking about somebody who is being allowed to live among you, doesn't actually come from among you, and has nowhere that's a particular home, but just wants to choose somewhere. Now, was this a lovely, lovely, kind offer by Israelite society because they were so worried about the welfare of slaves who escaped from foreign powers? Well, not really. In other ancient Near Eastern societies, there were bilateral treaties, and when you had these bilateral treaties, one of the parts of the treaty would be about mutual return of slaves. You know, our slave runs away to you, you let us have him back. Your slave runs away to us, we'll let you have him back. But Israel had no such bilateral treaties because they regarded all the surrounding areas as their enemies. So they weren't going to have bilateral treaties with them. They were as pretty much, as far as they were concerned, in a state of war with them. And why would they help another nation that they saw as their enemy by returning their property, by returning their slave, giving them more manpower? No, you know, if you get a slave who comes over the border, you're going to stick it to your enemy by saying, yeah, you could stay here. Yeah, fine, you know.
It's kind of humiliation of the nation, isn't it? Well, we're looking after your slaves.
Yeah, that's right.
And you didn't treat them well. We're treating them well.
And it's also implicitly going to be an encouragement to their slaves to run away, and therefore it's a way of undermining them.
Mm. Yeah, I think treaties are surely a bit of an overstatement, or certainly all the connotations we would have concerning a treaty, because like a written document or anything like that. Surely ancient nations didn't go in for that sort of thing, did they?
Well, I believe they did. I mean, I haven't looked up the. I haven't got my historical documentation to show that, because I mean, it's just something that was my understanding, and I wasn't expecting you to ask that question.
I think there is things like that, though.
I mean, there had to be treaties. I mean, ever since there have been nations, there have been treaties between nations, but there weren't. I mean, does it have to be in writing?
Yeah,
there is
contracts, it would be. Probably it would be, because you would always want to be able to go back to it. And in the same way that you had written codes,
there's vows and contracts.
You would have a written treatment. Yes, you had contracts. You had written contracts internally, and a treaty is just a contract between two nations.
Yes, okay.
So I would be surprised if they weren't written down. I mean, I can go and try and check it out for the next.
No, I've got an example for you. Okay. When they went into to killing the nations to go and kill everyone in Canaan, there were some people on the outside that had a treaty. There was sort of the laws to say, for the people on the outside, you can, if they come out and ask for peace, you can make them your slaves and not kill them all, basically, which is an interesting choice. And one of them came out and said, we live out here, or they deceived Israel and said, we don't live in the land or near the land. It was something like that. So they made this sort of contract and vow, and Israel couldn't go back on it. So they were absolutely pissed, basically, that they had to keep to the agreement not to kill them. But they deceived them by saying they weren't who they were, or something like that. And so there was this sort of honouring of a vow, and which is like a contract, I suppose. You keep your end, I'll keep my end. Otherwise, they could have said, well, you deceived us, we'll just kill you. So there was something being honoured,
right,
against their annoyance, you know. So they were all slaves. So there's things like that went on in the text.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so the last of the strictly kind of Old Testament law myths, the myth that the Old Testament laws prohibited kidnapping somebody to make them a slave.
Yes, they prohibited kidnapping, again, fellow Israelites to make them a slave. But foreigners were fair game. The Deuteronomy 24:7 is absolutely explicit. If someone is caught kidnapping a fellow Israelite and treating or selling them as a slave, the kidnapper must die. There's a similar provision in Exodus 21:16, which doesn't specify fellow Israelite. But then again, given how much of the Bible is about being able to take slaves as war booty. Well, what is that if it's not kidnapping? The people,
the Benjamite situation we mentioned, Francis.
Yes, that's right. Which I'm not as au fait with as you are, but it was something to do with kidnapping women so that the tribe of Benjamin could continue to exist because they killed all their women. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, something like that. And so they didn't go. So they thought, well, okay, we go over here, and they killed all the people, and then took the women, forced them basically to be their wives. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to continue the tribe. And again, another passage to look at sometime. But this idea of kidnapping or taking war booty in the sense of women was again standard ancient Near East stuff, no different with Israel in war. So it's very interesting then to say this passage about stealing. And that's really what I see that is about stealing. The Bible is very sort of strong on thou shalt not steal. It doesn't say thou shalt not have a slave, but thou shalt not steal. And so buying a slave particularly is a very different thing than stealing a person if you're going to make a slave of them. And then, like you say, the distinction between Israel, again, it's a form of racial difference. So that's how I'd see that.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, time's moving on. So I reckon we'll do a little bit on the New Testament and then leave it for the rest of the summer to pick up in future episodes on other aspects.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, except I thought we might just cover that passage in the Old Testament that talks about the beating of the slave. Or do you think that fits in?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
because that is absolutely fascinating. It's a key passage in all sort of apologetic discussions.
That would be good. Yeah, let's do it.
And critical ones. And I have some interesting things to say on that. And it's amazing.
I'm absolutely desperate for the loo. I can't think of anything else. So I'll go off and do that. And I'll be right.
Well, you're a slave, so you can't. Okay, Ed, I hope that was okay. You're back now.
I'm feeling so much better. Right.
So much better. So, Francis, could you read that passage out?
Well, shall I read it as the version gets up after a day or two?
Yes, that's right. And then we'll talk about the variants. Yeah.
Okay.
If a man strikes his male or female servant with a rod, and the servant dies by his hand, he shall surely be punished. However, if the servant gets up after a day or two, the owner shall not be punished, since the servant is his property.
Great. That's an interesting verse. So what we'll do is go to Ed, and how have you sort of seen this verse used and thought about it yourself?
Well, it's a sort of go-to. You get the kind of angry Matt Dillahunty giving it one to some hapless caller on his atheist experience.
I've seen that, yeah.
He loves it. He goes to this all the time. Yeah. So I think I've got a probably... my mind has been directed down that track, so it'd be good to see if there's a wider view.
Yes, well, there is really as a wider view, because it's one of these things like if you really know discussions about what other Christians say or Hebrew studies and Hebrew scholars on words, you start to then unpack and think, oh gosh, this is just like that one about the abortion one in where the woman, does it mean this? Does it mean that? And the Hebrew allows certainly for that, and it also allows for that. And then you have to go, oh my gosh, which expert do you want to believe? Then you start, which expert about the context do you want to believe? And on we go back to my thing again.
Does it mean
so ambiguous?
Causes a miscarriage, or does it mean?
Yes. And it could, and you can argue both ways because of the Hebrew isn't clear, and that divine inspiration again starts to be questioned. But yeah, just to outline before Francis can say a bit more about this, that I looked at the sort of the Hebrew. It sounds great, doesn't it? I read the Hebrew. No, I looked at the Hebrew sort of English equivalent next to the Hebrew wording and saw that the essence of this thing about surviving is based around the idea, I think it's got something to do with the word stand up. And so it could mean that he's not killed straight away, which is quite clear. If he's not killed straight away, that is, and he lingers a couple of days and then stands up, and i.e. you've beaten him almost the inch of his life and he survives. That's one way. That's the way the atheist experience, by the way, take it, which was interesting because the more common way is that actually he's not killed straight away, but his injuries are so bad that he dies after a couple of days. So you're talking about killing a slave, but if it's not instant, he's not slave owners not punished. So, Francis, can you pick up on those two variant ways of how this has looked and what you've thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've just actually been trying to find the alternative, and the translation that I've always looked at, which is where after the bit about he dies and the owner will be punished, the more, I think it's fair to say, more usual translation or the traditional translation is, but if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Now, what does
well, that's
I mean, does the translation that I first read out, which is if he gets up after a day or two, the owner shall not be punished. How does that? Does that make sense? Does that make more sense than if he lingers a day or two?
I think so. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's like, well, in one sense, I mean, first of all, nobody's disagreeing with the fact that he's beaten harshly with a rod, and so you've got some treatment or strong treatment that's being regulated here. And punished, by the way, is also difficult because Paul-Copan says it means the death penalty. Thom-Stark says it's very vague. It doesn't mean the death penalty, but can be used to refer to it. But it's certainly never used in the legal codes as a death penalty, like other word that could have been used here. So punished could not necessarily mean the death penalty. So that's vague, or potentially both ways. But yeah, I mean, it does. You have different conclusions. Does it mean that, okay, you can beat them? It's okay to beat them as long as you don't kill them. Or if they die after a few days, it's still okay to beat them, or not okay, but you're going to get away from being punished. But as I said, Francis, there's another interpretation that I came across, which is like, I believe the verse before it about the tooth.
After it.
Now, could you read that one out?
I've got NIV here.
Yeah, if you read the one about the tooth, great.
An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And if an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth.
Right. And so the argument that I heard made was, given that context, that it's strikingly odd that if you knock a tooth out and the slave can go free, but you beat the guy after death and he just continues to be a slave. The argument that I heard was that, in fact, the assumption would be that the punishment is different if he survives and gets up after a couple of days after that kind of beating. It doesn't say it, of course, and this is where you could disagree with it, but it doesn't say it. But the assumption would be, with the logic of the verse you just read, was that the punishment wouldn't be anything other than losing the slave because he can now go free. And so I thought, well, at first I thought this was ridiculous, and I thought, well, actually, to be honest, if I'm being honest about the context, it would be odd, so you could beat the slave almost to death and he's a slave for life if he does survive, and then you can knock a tooth out and he can go. And I'm thinking, okay, there's something not right there, I think, in the system. So there may be a possibility that then you have to take the verse that he survives. If he dies, the question is that, okay, the slave owner isn't punished in any way apart from the loss of the slave because he was his property. I mean, that has problems right there, doesn't it? Right there. So whichever way you cut this, there's problems with morality. But I'm just thinking there's a lot of variance before anyone stands up and says it's this or it's that, apologist or complete atheist, fundamentalist critique. So what would you say to that, Francis?
Well, I'm just thinking it through now. So if you beat, what is the significance then of recovering after a day or two?
You mean if you take the view that he gets better, he doesn't actually die?
Yes.
That you'd have to take that interpretation if he was free.
I'm not sure why you would need verse 21 to qualify verse 20. I mean, it seems to me that if you're saying that if you beat someone and they die, then the beater shall be punished, that's a standalone provision. If you are saying if you beat someone and they don't die, then they're not to be punished.
which is what the text is. If that's the case, if he doesn't die, this is why it's very, very difficult. I mean, what should have been said is that if you beat your slave and he survives and gets up after a few days, you shall let him go free, like the guy who's had his tooth knocked out. That's what it should have said, if you're going to go that line. Yeah, but it doesn't say that, so we can't quite.
It's in the wrong order.
Yeah. To do that.
It's sort of assuming something that's listed further down in the law.
Yeah.
I mean, it says. I don't see the need for Section 21.
That's the lawyer coming out of you. Right.
I don't see the need for verse 21 if all you're saying is that as long as you don't beat your slave to death, you won't be punished. I mean, it just seems to me that all you would need then would be verse 20. If you beat your slave to death, you'll be punished. Okay.
Yes, I see what you mean.
We can move on now. We're done with that. We don't need a section to say if you beat your slave not to death, you won't be punished because the slave is your property.
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems unnecessary. It seems completely pointless to have that in there. And whereas I think you can see the point of putting it in if somebody beat their slave, didn't carry on beating them until they were dead, but gave them a severe beating, and then, oops, didn't mean for that to happen. Whoa, 2 days later, got no slave now. And I think the suggestion there, the servant is his property, is, this would be my interpretation, they are already punished by the death of their slave because they've lost money.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I take it, that he does die after lingering.
Yes.
Not get up after 2 days. Yeah. I mean, if I was beaten, if I had the strength and would survive, I'd probably try and knock my tooth out then myself.
Hit me in the mouth. Hit me in the mouth.
Yeah, that's right. So there's all kinds of ways. But yes, but my point really is that the variance of the context and the word of Hebrews in punished and in dying is so up there that you have experts that would take it one way or the other, and it's not just the simple reader can't just say it means this or that. But I tend to take the idea that my natural reading I still stay with, which is that he dies after a couple, not that. Ed, you took it that way?
You've confused me so much.
You thought that the slave died after the beating?
No, I think.
You think he got up?
I never thought about it really.
Right. Okay. So that's why we do a podcast like this, to get into it. So hopefully, any listener thinking you want to be nerdy enough or worried enough about this passage, then go away and look at it, and you might come out as confused as we are.
Yes, I think I get it in the end, because it's not just beat the slave; it's with a rod. So it looks like it's some prescribed thing you do with your to punish a slave.
Yes, it looks like it's regulating something that's happening.
Yeah.
And so it's trying to keep...
So it's not just flying in a fit and punching them in the face and knocking out a tooth or an eye. It's, they've done something wrong. What slave masters do is hit them with rods in a kind of controlled way. But if you get it out of hand and you actually kill them, then that is serious. But if you do that normally and for some reason there's an infection or something and by mistake they die after a day or two, then there's no need for punishment because you've lost a slave. Okay. So I guess we've run out of time. So we'll do the New Testament as well in a bit more, cover it a bit more next time.
Yes, that's right, and I'd love to talk about and in the New Testament the verse that I wasn't really aware of, which was the slave traders in that whole passage, and how that's one interpretation of that verse in the New Testament, that slave traders go in the whole list of lying and all kinds of homosexuality or whatever. It's interesting because it's normally man killers, so we'll look at that. Sorry, not man stealers, and
we've got five more myths from Francis, including. The slave was actually rather nice.
Yeah. So our listeners look like they might be slaves until 2020. Indentured, though. Indentured.
When's the next Jubilee?
When is it?
Lovely. Okay, so lots to come. And until we appear in your feed in September, that's goodbye from us.
And it's goodbye from me.
Yeah, it's goodbye from me.
Cheers. Bye.